Have you ever had one of those moments where someone looks at you, and it's like the ground drops out from under you? Your heart's hammering away. Your thoughts are a jumbled mess. You don't know whether to move or stay rooted, and it feels like the whole world's flipped upside down. That's where my story kicks off. But here's the kicker. Those looks, they came from my son. Yes, you heard me right, my own boy, Ethan. Now, before we dive in, let me give you a heads up. This tale isn't light. It's packed with the messy stuff. Motherhood, family ties, betrayal, and those shadowy corners we all tuck away inside. If that sounds like too much for you, maybe hit pause now and save yourself the unease. But if you're sticking around, I'm about to walk you through how a quiet storm brewed right inside my own home. How everything I knew shifted, inch by inch, day after day. So grab your tea, or coffee, if that's your thing. Pull up a chair because this is going to be a long one. If you've already liked the video and hit subscribe, and we're good to go. Ready? Here we go. It all snuck up on me so softly, so gradually that I didn't even clock it at first. One ordinary day, Ethan, my son, came back from university. I heard the knock at the door, opened it, and there he was, standing on the porch with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "Mom," he said, his voice low. "School got to me. I just need to come home for a bit, clear my head." He'd always been a quiet one, my Ethan, kept things close to his chest. Even as a little boy, he wasn't the type to spill his troubles. I'd have to read them in the way his brow furrowed, or his eyes darted away. His father, Ryan, and I had been married for 15 years. 15 long, winding years, but most of that time felt like a hollow shell. Ryan was married to his job, not to us. I raised Ethan single-handedly, more or less. I still remember that first moment I held him, in the hospital, his tiny fingers curling around mine, so fragile yet so fierce. I whispered to myself, "From this day on, my life belongs to you." He was my world, my heartbeat, my light in the dark. But that day he came back home, dragging his bag through the door. Something was different. The Ethan I'd sent off to college wasn't the one standing in front of me. There was a shadow in his eyes, a heaviness in the way he carried himself, like the world had chewed him up and spat him back out, leaving him lost. Those first few weeks were peaceful, or so they seemed on the surface. Ethan would retreat to his room most of the time, door shut, the faint hum of music, or the tapping of his phone the only signs he was there. Sometimes he'd wander down to the living room, plop onto the couch, and just stare at his screen, jaw tight, brows knitted, like he was wrestling with something big inside. "Hey, son, what's going on?" I'd ask, keeping my tone soft, so he wouldn't feel cornered. "Nothing, Mom," he'd mutter, brushing me off with a shrug. I didn't push him. Ethan was never one to open up on command. I figured he'd come to me when he was ready, like he always had as a kid. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The house didn't feel the same anymore. The air had thickened, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We were both in it together, yet neither of us could name what we were bracing for. Then I started catching those looks. At first, I didn't think much of it. Told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. Picture this. One evening, I'm in the kitchen, the smell of a simmering stew filling the air, wooden spoon in hand as I stir the pot. Suddenly, I feel it, a prickle on the back of my neck, like someone's watching. I turn around, and there's Ethan, leaning against the doorway, just staring at me. Not a word, not a move, just those eyes fixed on me. "What's up, son?" I asked, trying to sound casual, like it was no big deal. "Nothing," he said, quick to look away, his head dipping down. But those eyes, they didn't see me as his mom in that moment. It was like he was looking at someone else entirely. Someone I didn't recognize. "Oh, come off it. You're imagining things." I scolded myself, shaking my head as I turned back to the stove. But once that thought wormed its way in, it set up camp in my head and refused to budge. It followed me everywhere after that feeling. I'd be in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book I wasn't really reading, the pages blurring as my mind wandered. I'd glance up, and there he'd be, Ethan, sprawled on the armchair across from me, his gaze locked on me like I was the only thing in the room. "You got something to say?" I'd ask, raising an eyebrow, hoping he'd laugh it off. "No, Mom," he'd reply, his voice flat, but his eyes still burning into me. The silence that followed was louder than words. I'd feel it walking down the hall, my slippers scuffing against the hardwood, knowing he was somewhere behind me, watching. Sometimes our eyes would lock for a split second. He'd flick his away, but a heartbeat later, they'd be back on me. It was almost like he wanted me to know, like he was daring me to call it out. And here's the part I hate admitting, the part that twists me up inside. Part of me didn't mind it. Maybe, God help me, maybe I even liked it. Just thinking that makes me feel sick, like I've swallowed something sour that's clawing its way back up. But I'm not gonna lie to you. After years of feeling like a ghost in my own life, those looks lit something up inside me, something I'd buried deep and thought was dead. Why did it hit me like that? Well, my life's been no walk in the park, that's for damn sure. Things with Ryan were magic at the start. I can still see it. Those early days when he'd look at me across a crowded room, his eyes soft and warm, like I was the sun he orbited around. He'd take my hand, his grip gentle but firm, and murmur, "I'm scared of losing you," like I was something precious he couldn't bear to let slip away. But somewhere along the line, that light dimmed. It started with the small stuff. No more goodnight kisses pressed to my forehead. No more "how was your day?" over dinner. Then came the silence, thick and suffocating, settling between us like a wall I couldn't break through. We'd sit in the same room, him on one end of the table, me on the other, and it was like I wasn't even there. I'd try. Lord, how I tried. Wearing a new dress that hugged my curves just right, fussing with my hair until it fell in soft waves. Anything to catch his eye. But he'd barely glance up from his phone, muttering about work or nothing at all. Every time he ignored me, every time his hand didn't reach for mine, I faded a little more. I became invisible, a shadow of the woman I used to be. We stopped fighting eventually. There was nothing left to fight for. When he walked out that door for the last time, bags in hand, I didn't shed a tear. I thought I'd feel free, like a weight had lifted, but all I felt was a hollow ache. Who was I now? Not a wife, not someone desired, not someone seen, just a mom. And even that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. When Ethan headed off to university, I told myself, well, that's it. I did my job. He'd go build his life, and I'd scrape together some kind of existence for myself, figure out who I was without him to anchor me. But then he came back, and it all flipped upside down. Those looks started creeping in. At first, I brushed it off as nonsense. "I'm just tired, seeing things," I'd mutter to myself. But there it was again, me in the kitchen, chopping onions with tears stinging my eyes, feeling that weight on my back. I'd turn, and Ethan would be there, silent, staring, not like a son looks at his mom, but something else, something heavier. My stomach would twist into knots, a mix of dread and something I couldn't name, but I didn't say a word. I should have stopped it right then. Should have said, "Ethan, what the hell's this about?" and drawn a line in the sand. But I didn't. Why? I don't know. Maybe it was guilt. He looked like he'd lost everything out there. School, his dreams, his spark. I didn't want to pile more onto him. Or maybe, God forgive me, maybe I liked how it felt. After years of being unseen, like I was nothing but a faint outline, someone noticing me, especially Ethan, woke something up. It was wrong. I knew it down to my bones. But once that feeling took hold, I couldn't shake it loose. It didn't stop there. It kept building, day after day. One afternoon, I was in the living room, a book open on my lap. But the words might as well have been written in another language for all I took them in. I felt his presence before I saw him. Ethan, slouched in the armchair, his eyes pinned on me. "Something on your mind, son?" I asked, forcing a lightness into my voice. "No," he said, but those eyes were screaming something else, something he wouldn't let past his lips. Another time, in the kitchen, I was stirring a pot of soup, the steam curling up around my face, when that familiar weight settled over me. I turned, and there he was, leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, looking like he didn't have a care in the world. But his eyes? They were anything but careless. They were intense, alive, saying all the things he couldn't. Me? I kept acting like I didn't see it. Or maybe I wasn't acting. Maybe I just didn't know what to do with it. Because every time it happened, it stirred something in me. Something I didn't want to face. Something I didn't even know was still alive inside. Then there was that evening with the back door. The lock had jammed. Old house, old problems, and I was hunched over it, screwdriver in hand, muttering curses under my breath as I tried to pry it loose. I didn't hear him come up behind me until his voice cut through the quiet. "Hold on, Mum. Let me take a look," he said. He stepped in close, too close. I could feel the warmth of him, the brush of his breath against my neck as he reached for the tool. His hand grazed mine, just for a second, and I froze, every muscle locked up, my breath catching in my throat. "I should have stepped back," said. "I've got this," and put some space between us. But I didn't move. Neither did he. He took the screwdriver, fiddled with the lock until it clicked open, then handed it back to me without a word. He walked off like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Something had shifted. Something unnamed but real, hanging in the air between us. From that night on, the house felt different. Tense, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. Every glance, every brush past each other in the hall, felt charged, like we were teetering on the edge of something we couldn't take back. I didn't know what was coming, didn't want to know, but deep down I think I already did. And that scared the hell out of me. One night, I dragged myself home late, well past midnight. Work had been a slog, my shift stretching longer than it had any right to. My feet throbbed with every step, my head pounded like a drum, and all I wanted was to collapse into bed and let the day fade away. I walked into the house, the darkness greeting me like an old friend, but it felt off. Heavier, thicker, not the usual quiet I'd grown used to. I tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter with a clatter, shuffled toward my room, barely keeping my eyes open. As I got closer, I heard it. A soft sound, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Just the wind, I told myself, picturing an open window fluttering the curtains. But it wasn't that. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, and when I pushed it open, I saw him, Ethan, sitting on the edge of my bed, his silhouette stark against the dim glow slipping through the blinds. We didn't say anything at first, just sat there in the dark. The silence pressing down like a weight neither of us could shake. "Talk to me," I finally whispered, my voice softer than I meant it to be, almost a plea. He didn't answer right away. He stared at the floor, hands balled into fists like he was holding himself together by sheer will. Then finally, he spoke, his voice shaky and raw. "Mom, I don't know what's wrong with me. I know it's messed up. I know it's wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I should have shut it down. Should have said, "No, Ethan. Stop this right now," and sent him out. But the words wouldn't come. Because, damn me to hell, part of me didn't want him to stop. That realization made me hate myself. A deep, gnawing loathing clawed at my insides. Did we talk more? Did we sit there in silence? I can't even remember. All I recall is the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing that mattered in the universe, and how that look pinned me in place. By the time the sun peeked through the curtains, I stumbled back to my room, shut the door, and lay there. One thought looping in my head. Nothing's ever gonna be the same. Everything changed after that night. Another evening, I was in the living room, the TV flickering with some show I wasn't watching, my mind a million miles away. I heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the hall. He stopped in the doorway, a shadow against the light spilling from the kitchen. "Mom," he said, his voice so soft it barely reached me. I didn't turn around, kept my eyes on the screen, pretending I didn't feel the air shift when he stepped in. "Mom, you okay?" he asked again. I turned my head, and our eyes met. Something inside me splintered. He took a step closer, then another, and I didn't stop him. I should have. God knows I should have. But I just sat there, frozen, waiting to see what he'd do. He sat down next to me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him. My hands shook in my lap. My heart thumped so loud I swore he could hear it, but I didn't move. His gaze was unbearable, heavy with something I couldn't, or wouldn't, name. I wanted to tell him to go, to get up and leave, to pretend none of this was real. But I couldn't, because deep down, I didn't want him to leave. And that's the part that guts me, the part I can't forgive myself for. He reached out, his fingers brushing mine, light as a feather, like he was testing me, waiting for me to pull back. I didn't. I let him take my hand, and I hated how it made me feel. Alive, wanted, seen, for the first time in years. "Mom," he said again, his voice cracking on the word. I looked at him, and his eyes, those damn eyes, were wide, nervous, desperate, like he was reaching for something he didn't know how to grab hold of. Instead of pushing him away, instead of standing up and walking out, I let him lean closer. When it happened, it didn't feel real, like a dream I couldn't wake from. It was slow, tentative, like we were both holding our breath, waiting for the other to call it off. But neither of us did. He was gentle, careful, like he was afraid I'd shatter. And me, I didn't feel like myself. I was outside my body, watching it unfold, powerless to stop it. I knew it was wrong. Every fiber of me screamed it, but I didn't stop it. I didn't want to. And in the middle of it, memories flooded in. Ethan as a little boy, running through the house, his big, toothy grin lighting up the room, tugging at my sleeve. "Mom, play with me." His laugh, high and sweet, echoing down the halls as we built Lego towers together. He was my son, still is my son, and now I couldn't look at him without feeling like I'd destroyed everything, like I'd broken him, broken us. The next day, the house was suffocating. Ethan stayed upstairs, shut away in his room. I lingered downstairs, haunting the kitchen like a restless spirit. We couldn't face each other, couldn't bear to meet eyes. All day we dodged it. Around noon, I heard him moving above me, the creak of the floorboards, but he didn't come down. I didn't go up. I busied myself, wiping counters that were already clean, flipping through a magazine I didn't read, anything to keep my hands moving, my mind blank. But nothing worked. Every sound, the hum of the fridge, the tick of the clock, carried his name. Every corner of that house held him, held us, and I couldn't escape it. By evening, I was in the kitchen again, rinsing a glass I didn't need when he came in. "Mom," he said, his voice so quiet I almost missed it, hands stuffed in his pockets, shoulders slumped like he was trying to shrink. I turned, and his face, God, his face, nearly broke me. He looked lost, ashamed, young again, like the little boy who'd climb into my lap when a storm scared him, whispering, "Hold me, Mom." All I could think was how far we'd fallen, how far I'd let us fall. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone careful, like he was tiptoeing around broken glass. I wanted to say yes, wanted to sit him down, wrap my arms around him, tell him we'd sort it out, that we'd fix this somehow. But I couldn't. I couldn't even hold his gaze for more than a heartbeat. I turned back to the sink, the cold water running over my hands, and muttered, "Not now." My voice came out sharp, distant, like I didn't care. But I did, too much. That's why I couldn't face him. Couldn't find the words to unravel this mess. What could I say? How do you fix something like that? The thought that maybe it couldn't be fixed, it crushed me. He didn't argue, didn't push. He just nodded, a small defeated dip of his head, and walked out, his footsteps fading up the stairs. Alone again, I stood there, the glass slipping from my fingers into the sink, and felt like the worst person alive. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the shadows stretching long and jagged across the room. His voice echoed in my head. "Mom, Mom, Mom, Mom," soft, broken. A plea I couldn't answer. I kept telling myself it'd get better, that we'd find a way to move past it, shove it down deep where it couldn't touch us. But I didn't believe it. Deep down, I knew the truth. Nothing would ever be the same. I clung to the hope that time would dull it, that if we just avoided each other, pretended it never happened, it'd fade like a bad dream. But it didn't. If anything, it got worse. The silence between us grew louder, deafening, filling every inch of the house. Every shared space became a minefield. Step wrong, and it'd all blow up. The tension wasn't just ours anymore. Others started picking up on it too. Clock at 8 p.m. Cade, my ex, was the first to notice. He swung by one afternoon to grab a box of old books he'd left in the garage years ago. The moment he stepped inside, I felt his eyes on me, sharp and searching. Cade always had a knack for reading me, even after everything. "You look tired," he said, leaning against the kitchen counter like he still belonged there. Arms crossed, his voice laced with concern. "Just work," I lied, shrugging it off, stirring a pot of coffee I didn't need. He didn't buy it. "Everything okay? You seem off," he pressed, his tone gentle but insistent. For a second, I almost cracked, almost let it all spill out right there over the chipped formica. But how could I? How do you look someone in the eye and say something like that? I couldn't. "I'm fine," I said, plastering on a smile that felt like it might break my face. He let it drop, eventually. But when he left, his backward glance told me he wasn't fooled. Then there was Tiana, Ethan's girlfriend. She'd been popping in more lately, unannounced, her visits stretching longer each time. At first, I thought it was sweet. She wanted to be close to him, help him through whatever had dragged him back home. But then I caught her eyes lingering on me when I'd walk into a room, studying me like she was piecing together a puzzle. She didn't know what was wrong. Not exactly, but she felt it, the shift, the unease. It scared me senseless. What if she kept looking? What if she dug too deep and figured it out? If she did, if anyone did, I didn't know how I'd survive it. I thought I was holding it together, keeping my mask in place, my emotions locked tight. But then Peyton came over. Peyton's been my rock for years. Knows me better than I know myself most days. The second she walked through the door, she clocked it. "You've been distant," she said, settling across from me at the kitchen table, her arms crossed like she was ready to dig in. Something's up. What is it? Her voice was firm, no nonsense. The way it gets when she's worried. I'm fine, I said, staring into my tea, watching the steam curl up as my hands trembled around the cup. Don't give me that. Talk to me, she pushed, leaning forward, her eyes boring into me. I could feel her picking me apart, my hunched shoulders, the way I wouldn't meet her gaze, the shaky grip on that damn mug. For a moment, I teetered on the edge of telling her everything, the whole ugly truth. But I stopped myself. How could I say it out loud? How could I face her after that? I'm okay, Peyton, I whispered, forcing another brittle smile. She didn't buy it. I saw it in the tight line of her mouth. But she didn't press further. All right, she sighed, but her look said she'd be back for answers. My stomach twisted. She wouldn't let it go forever, and I wasn't sure how long I could keep up the lie. The days stretched on, each one heavier, darker, like storm clouds piling up with no release. Ethan and I barely spoke. Short words here and there, nothing real. The house was silent, but it wasn't the calm kind. It was thick, oppressive, like we were circling something too dangerous to touch. We both knew it was there, lurking, but we couldn't face it. Then one night, it all came crashing down. I'd gone to bed early, desperate for sleep to wipe my mind clean. But it wouldn't come. I lay there, eyes tracing cracks in the ceiling, replaying everything. The looks, the touches. That night, we crossed the line. How did this happen? I kept asking myself, over and over. But I knew. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow burn. A thread unraveling bit by bit. And I'd let it happen. I wanted to undo it, claw it back, but I couldn't. Worse, I wasn't sure I wanted to. At some point, I must have drifted off. Because when my eyes snapped open, the room was pitch black. But I wasn't alone. I felt him before I saw him, a presence at the foot of my bed. My heart slammed against my ribs. For a split second, I thought it was a dream, my exhausted mind conjuring ghosts. Then I heard it, a soft breath, a step closer, and then Mom. His voice, a shaky whisper, heavy with something I didn't want to name. I sat up, my breath shallow, pulse roaring in my ears. Ethan, I managed, barely a sound. He didn't move, just stood there in the dark, a silhouette against the faint moonlight. I knew why he was there, I knew, but I still asked, "What are you doing?" He let out a breath, like he'd been holding it forever, waiting for me to speak. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice cracking. "I know it's wrong. I know. But I don't know how to stop." My stomach lurched, bile rising in my throat. I wanted to scream at him to leave, to beg him to pretend this never happened, but I didn't. I couldn't. Because some twisted, broken part of me didn't want him to go. And that was the worst of it. If this story hit you as hard as it's hit me, don't forget to smash that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe if you haven't already. How does someone fall into something like this? What's next for this house, for us? Let's hash it out below. I'll be reading every